Alright everyone, a very good morning to all of you once again. So in this particular tutorial, we would now be seeing, after having discussed the entire South African case study, we will be discussing why precisely do we need a constitution, and again we will be answering it using the South African example itself. Because the South African example is actually a very good example, it is a very good case study to understand the need for a constitution and its role in society. Right? So if you remember in the last tutorial we had discussed that both the oppressor, which is the white government, and the oppressed, which are the blacks, right, sat together in the same room on the same table, held debates, held discussions, held deliberations in order to reach a particular conclusion and in order to draft this document called the Constitution. And I'm sure you realize, and I'm hoping that you realize, that this is not going to be a very easy task to do. People who have been enemies for the longest time, they cannot really come together overnight and reach a peaceful, amicable conclusion, right? So over here I have written as well that the oppressor and the oppressed planned to live together, and it was not going to be easy. And after all those deliberations, after all those negotiations, there were certain compromises that both parties agreed to. Now this is very important. This can also be asked, that what was the outcome of the discussions that the oppressors and the oppressed had in South Africa? What was the compromise they had reached? Right? So if you talk about the whites had agreed to the principle of majority rule, as in the majority, who were the blacks, would now be given political rights, would now be allowed to fight elections, would now be allowed to form the government. Like for instance, Nelson Mandela I mentioned, right? Nelson Mandela became the first president of the independent nation of South Africa, right? They agreed to the principle of majority rule. They agreed to universal adult franchisee as well, that is one person, one vote, one value. They agreed to that as well. They also agreed for some basic fundamental rights for the poor, the marginalized, the workers, so on and so forth. They agreed to that as well, right? And on the other hand, the blacks, right? Now it's a compromise, so compromise happens on both the sides. So the blacks agreed that the majority rule would not be absolute. Do you understand? In the sense that it will not be a dictatorship. Not dictatorship. Am I being clear? It will not be an absolute rule. That means the whites will be allowed to criticize, the whites will be allowed to dissent, the whites will be allowed to convey their displeasure, right? It will not be absolute. So please try and understand this very well. The blacks had agreed कि अगर वो लोग गवर्नमेंट बना रहे हैं तो उनका जो रूल है वो डिक्टेटोरियल नहीं होगा, वो एब्सोल्यूट नहीं होगा. They had also agreed that the majority, that is the blacks, will not take away the property of the minority whites. See, this happened in many nations, right? That the moment the majority came to power, they started committing the same atrocities that the other party had committed on them. But the blacks promised over here that they will not take away the property, houses, industries, whatever property the whites owned, right? They will not take away any of those property. So this is a very fair compromise to come at, right? So you see, there are a couple of compromises, right? There are a couple of discussions that are happening, and through a peaceful and a democratic way, there are certain compromises that people are agreeing upon, right? And now when you're reaching these compromises, it is not that you can just give oral promises and everything will be hunky-dory, right? That is not going to work. सबको written में चाहिए होता है, right? Obviously. Everybody wants a written agreement. Everybody wants some written down rules so that everybody can follow those rules. Only then will you be able to build and maintain this trust. Am I being clear? See, this is very logical, okay? It is very, very logical. Like without a written agreement, even a marriage contract is a written agreement, right? When people get married to each other, they just don't do it out of nowhere. There's a proper agreement, legal agreement that is signed, right? Am I being clear? So everything is written down. ठीक है? So there are some written down rules that everybody should abide by. And what are these rules? These rules are the rules that would be supreme. that no one would be able to ignore, that no one will be able to challenge, that no one will be able to rubbish away, right? Or or think of them as something that is not worth considering. These rules would be supreme. They would be the law of the land, so to speak. What would they be? They would be the law of the land, so to speak. Right? And this is nothing but, right, these set of basic rules that are listed down in a written manner in the form of a legal document, which tells the code by which people need to behave, by which political institutions need to function, by which society needs to function. This prescribed code of conduct, so to speak, with rules and regulations inside it, is called the Constitution. Am I being clear? So this is how we derive our understanding of the Constitution through the South African case study. कि कैसे इंडिपेंडेंस के बाद ऑप्रेसर और ऑप्रेस्ड साथ में बैठे. There were a couple of compromises that they reached, and of course they did not make verbal agreements to each other. There was a certain level of trust that had to be built. There was a certain level of promise that had to be made to each other, and that could have only been possible through the written medium. And that is precisely why all of them decided to sit down and codify, right, write down all of these promises, all of these rules, all of these regulations that nobody will be able to refuse in society, irrespective of whether it is Nelson Mandela or some worker on the road, right? And this basic supreme set of rules and regulations is called the Constitution, right? It is fairly easy. So now this brings us to the question, what exactly does a constitution do? Very important. So again, we were talking about trust, that how it helps to build trust between communities, right? How it helps communities to coordinate with one another, arrive at certain conclusions, govern the society, so on and so forth. So it does, that's the first thing that it does, right? Generates a degree of trust and coordination for different communities, different people in the society who live together. Very important. And then of course it talks about the government, कि government क्या है, क्यों है, government कैसे elect होती है, government का function क्या है. Obviously, who tells all of this? God doesn't come and tell all of this, right? It is the Constitution which says the manner in which the government will be elected and how it will be constituted. How many ministers will be there? How does the Prime Minister get elected? What is his role? How does the President get elected? What is his role? How does the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court get elected? What is his or her role? So on and so forth. Right? So it specifies how the government will be elected and constituted. Right? And moreover, specifies which authority would be given the power to make decisions. Right? Not everybody is given the power to make decisions. For example, in India, it is the parliament at the central level that makes the decisions, and the legislative assembly at the state level which makes the laws. Right? High Court doesn't make the law. Supreme Court doesn't make the law. Parliament makes the laws. Right? The Prime Minister is the head of the government, so to speak. Right? तो किस अथॉरिटी को कितना पावर देना है और उस पावर का एक्सटेंट क्या है? Obviously, Prime Minister doesn't have unlimited powers. President does not have unlimited powers. So where are all of these mentioned? All of these are mentioned in the Constitution itself. Am I being clear? And this, the fourth point is very important. Lays down certain limits on the powers of the government, right? Government cannot have uncontrolled power. Otherwise it becomes a dictatorship. Right? I think that's quite understandable. ठीक है? So कुछ limitation होता है power पे. Right? I hope you are able to understand. There are some levels of limitations on the powers of the government. Right? And these limitations are also written down in the Constitution itself. Right? And of course, a couple of other things. It talks about the basic fundamental rights. This you are all aware of. Right to freedom of expression, right to freedom of speech, right to freedom of dignity. Right to live a life with dignity, right to education, right to constitutional remedy. So a lot of fundamental rights exist, right? Which all the citizens can enjoy. That also it mentions. And last but not the least, right? It is basically a mirror. ठीक है, ये थोड़ा philosophical है. It is basically a mirror which reflects the aspirations of the people about creating a good society. Right? About what is a society that can be called an ideal society. Right? How does that idealistic society look like? How are people supposed to behave in that idealistic society? What is the government supposed to do in this idealistic society? What powers will they have in this idealistic society? So aspirations of the people, कि लोग क्या चाहते हैं basically अपने देश से, अपनी society से, right? So it reflects and expresses the aspirations of the people about creating a good society. Am I making sense? Right. So with this, I'm going to come to an end of this tutorial. Right. We will of course be carrying forward our discussion in the next segment. But now we will be looking at the Indian example. So please keep yourselves prepared. And if you have not watched the previous tutorials, please do make sure you're watching the previous tutorials first. Otherwise, things will fly above your head. Right. So with that, thank you and have a very good day.